Hello everyone and welcome back to Rival Recon here on Anfield Index Pro. I'm Harry Sethi. Still reeling from their poor display in the loss away to Brentford, the Reds recorded a disappointing draw against Wolves over the weekend to earn themselves an unwelcome replay later this month. With the flaws within Klopp's side easy for sides and managers across the league to identify and target, it seems as though little will change for the Reds unless they sign the midfield reinforcements the squad dearly needs. Nevertheless, whilst fans patiently hope for more business this window, the tough games continue to appear, with Liverpool heading down to Brighton this weekend for what's sure to be another competitive game against the Seagulls. Joining me as usual to share his perspective on how Brighton have developed under Roberto De Zerbi and where fans' expectations are for the rest of the season, we welcome back Brighton correspondent for The Athletic, Andy Naylor. Welcome back, Andy.
Nice to be with you again. It seems a while since we last spoke.
Yeah, and I think it was an interesting time when we last spoke, because obviously it was the first game, or just before the first game of the sort of De Zerbi era, with Graham Potter having sort of departed just in sort of mid-September. So it was an interesting time to speak with you in terms of sort of a little bit in the unknown in terms of sort of how he was going to make his stamp on the side, how the side were going to play, what the noticeable differences were going to be. And I was a bit more, I think, apprehensive about that game in terms of I was well aware of what Brighton had done to Liverpool at Anfield in the previous season. And sure enough, I thought, as has been quite commonplace this season with a number of different teams, Brighton came to Anfield and just dominated Liverpool in midfield. And I think Liverpool never had control of that game. It obviously ended up 3-3. Casting your mind back to that, Andy, I mean, what did you make of that performance? And obviously the very first sort of showing under the new manager.
Yeah, well, that was our first glimpse of De Zerbi ball, if you like. And, well, what an exciting glimpse it was if I cast my mind back to that game. Obviously went 2-0 up pretty early on. Liverpool came back, were in front, but Leandro Trossard completing a hat-trick to earn a very eventful point. And, that was obviously De Zerbi's introduction to the Premier League, and what an introduction it was. And it's kind of almost carried on that way since. Obviously there were the teething troubles. There were a few games after that where they struggled for goals, but you look at them now, we're talking about the highest goal scorers away in the division, not least after knocking 4 past your neighbours in their last Premier League outing, and another 5 in the FA Cup at Middlesbrough on Saturday, an informed Championship side. So they are flying in what is still the very early stages of life under Roberto De Zerbi.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll definitely come on to talk about the fact that I think we've had previous conversations where we've bemoaned sort of Brighton not being ruthless enough in the final third, and they've, as you say, I think it's 14 goals over the last 4 games, which is not bad at all, to be honest, especially when you think about some players who actually haven't necessarily been as involved as you would have maybe expected at the start of the season. Just on that game versus Liverpool, it's become, I think, quite a common thing now in terms of sort of the matchups between Brighton and Liverpool, that they're usually incredibly competitive games, and I think even when maybe the scoreline has flattered Liverpool in the past, for example, maybe it's usually been a much more competitive game than it showed. Brighton coming to Anfield for the second season in a row, like I mentioned, and showing absolutely zero fear, which is obviously sort of what we've seen across numerous grounds and in numerous games this season and last season as well. Just on, I mean, before we get into sort of De Zerbi and how he's influenced the side, I mean, just how far does that sort of show that Brighton have come in terms of sort of their confidence in these games?
Yeah, well, I think, they're pretty well established now, aren't they? I mean, they were actually promoted in 16-17, so they've been in the Premier League now since 17-18. That's been a process of development, initially under Christian to sort of stabilise, to stay in the division really. Moving on from that with Graham Potter. And then once he left for Chelsea, it's a case of trying to really build further on the way he's developed the club, hence the appointment of Roberto De Zerbi. So essentially now it's no longer really a surprise for Brighton to get a result against anyone, home or away, because on their day when they're really at their best, they're capable of beating anyone. Even the one kind of result that's eluded them so far is away to Manchester City. But even at Manchester City under Roberto De Zerbi, they played well, and there were times in that game where they looked capable of getting a result as well.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm looking forward to that last step in the evolution of Brighton figuring out a way to go to the Etihad and taking all 3 points. Maybe not this season, but maybe in future seasons. I think that will be an incredibly sort of it wouldn't be unexpected based upon sort of the evolution that we've seen of this side over the past few seasons, like you were talking about. In that Liverpool game, which finished 3-3, the first of the De Zerbi era, we spoke beforehand about sort of how he'd been brought in to try and be a continuation of the style that Graham Potter had gone for, perhaps with a few tweaks here and there. And I'd just like to sort of get your opinion. You mentioned sort of a bit of a tricky run that Brighton went on after that fixture, but some of the teething problems. But in terms of sort of the noticeable sort of tweaks that you've seen De Zerbi look to make, whether it be in terms of the personnel that he's ended up actually opting for more often than not, or the system that he's played, how has it differed from what you were used to before under Graham Potter?
Well, I think it's quite interesting that right at the end of his, I seem to remember what was his first press conference after pretty much everything had been asked. I actually put it to him that what would he say is the biggest difference between him and Graham Potter in terms of this kind of ethos. And he talked about controlling games, which was certainly interesting to any Brighton supporter, because I think most Brighton supporters felt that under Graham Potter they had an element of controlling games unlike anything they'd seen before. But he wants more of that. What's interesting is that the build-up actually starts often from even deeper than it did under Graham. He likes players to take responsibility on the ball in tight areas. They've got a lot of good, gifted, technical players in that respect. But he also likes tempo with the possession. He's very entertaining actually in the technical area, because you see him sometimes turning around to his staff in exasperation when one of the central defenders invariably maybe plays a safe pass square or dwells on the ball a bit too long when he thinks he can see a pass forward. So he's very proactive in that kind of energy and intensity in terms of pressing as well, out of possession. So and they've just got this. They've got so many players who are fluid in the positions they play, fluid in their movements, and he's really capitalising on that. You know, the threats from Brighton are coming from all over the pitch. So the kind of narrative that you spoke about before, which has been associated with them for a while, they need a goal-scoring striker. They need a goal-scorer, Brighton. If only they had a goal-scorer. That still pops up when they don't score. But that's kind of being put to bed, I think, by the way they can score from different areas. And also they've got another young striker coming through now, Evan Ferguson, who led the line at Everton, scored on his full Premier League debut, had scored coming on at Arsenal. He's another of these this seemingly relentless production line that Brighton have of really talented young players. That's both from within their own system, the academy, and from their recruitment, around the world now, really.
Yeah, I think for the Liverpool listeners who are sort of listened to this pod and the previous one against where we got sort of the opinion of sort of fans on sort of the development of Brentford as well. I mean, you're talking about sort of in Brentford and Brighton, it appears to be two incredibly well-run clubs in the way in which they go about recruitment, in the way in which they go about developing sort of their younger players, their academy players, and sort of the pathway through from the academy to the first team if they're good enough. Certainly in recruitment, I know there's been a lot of focus on the way in which Brighton have sort of discovered gems, it seems, across the market over the past few seasons. And of course, plenty of clubs sort of have their attention on different players over the past few seasons, with Basuma moving on, and I'm sure at one stage we'll probably mention the name of Moise Caicedo. But I think plenty of Liverpool fans come into this game this weekend probably thinking, well, actually, Brighton are at this point a better run club than Liverpool appear to be at the moment, given some of the off-pitch dysfunction that looks like it's creeping in. One thing I wanted to mention when I was just looking at some of the results there, and I was looking at the 3-3 against Liverpool, to take it right back to that as well. In the Trossard obviously scoring a hat-trick at Anfield. And he was somebody who I thought at the start of the season seemed to be quite an influential figure, and of late, of course, has been left out. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of the way in which he's maybe struggled to get into sort of De Zerbi's thinking. I saw a few links about sort of potentially him having a move away from Brighton, but then also sort of which players have actually been at the forefront for De Zerbi. Who are those players that you mentioned there? You know, the threats coming from all over the pitch, who've really stood up during that period.
If we just concentrate first on Leandro,
sure.
It's not for the first time in his Brighton career. He tends to be that kind of player where he'll have purple patches and then perhaps go a bit quiet. He was certainly in a purple patch to begin with under Roberto. Then he went off to the World Cup with Belgium. He was in a really good place. And for some, I mean, obviously Belgium had a very poor World Cup under Roberto Martinez, but almost inexplicably, he didn't really get used. It was Martinez preferred Eden Hazard ahead of him, which I think even surprised Eden Hazard to a certain extent. And came back from the World Cup, obviously off the back of that disappointing campaign, and he's played in 2.5 games. So that was the Carabao Cup tie at Charlton, where he came on, and then he had 2 starts playing as a false 9 against Southampton and Arsenal, because Danny Welbeck's been out injured. That I don't see that as being cited as a reason, because he was playing in that kind of role at Liverpool. And he's played in that position before. So, and rather interestingly, in his press conference, in the embargoed section of De Zerbi's press conference on Friday ahead of the Middlesbrough game, I asked him about Leandro, and he was very open. And essentially, what he said was that he's got to give his all in training and games, or he won't be back in. So that there's clearly some feeling there. Obviously, he sees the players not just in games, but in training, day in, day out. That maybe the customary speculation swirling around.
Yeah.
I mean, Leandro's contract situation is that he's out in the summer, but Brighton have a year's option, so he's not really out, if you see what I mean.
Of course.
There's been talk of Chelsea and Potter, obviously linked there, talk of Newcastle, Dan Ashworth linked, former technical director, all and sundry, the usual. I've seen Tottenham today, but he basically, there's no way, Brighton's position is quite clear on all of whether it's Moises Caicedo, Alexis McAllister, Trossard, quite clear. No player will be going in this window unless they receive some kind of pretty extraordinary bid for them, something that would outstrip anything they might be able to get in the summer window. Now, I'm not saying these players will go in the summer window, but if you look at Brighton's business over the last sort of 2 or 3 seasons, when they've made big sales, it's been in the summer. Ben White to Arsenal, Yves Bissouma to Tottenham, although his situation was slightly different because he was out of contract.
Yeah.
And Marc Cucurella to Chelsea. So I don't see anything happening with any of them at the very earliest summer. And who knows, maybe not even then. I mean, there's a huge incentive for Brighton there. They're certainly in the mix, I think, to qualify for European football for the first time in their history. And obviously, that if they can continue to do well for the rest of the season, that's only going to help in them trying to hold on to some of their stars.
Yeah, I think you're right there. I mean, I think plenty of people will be listening to this pod, sort of, waiting for me to ask that question about sort of Moises Caicedo, and naturally that there have been links whilst not being links between him and Liverpool, which has been quite frustrating, I think, over the past few weeks, because I'm actually of the same opinion that you are, actually, in that I think Brighton have every reason to keep hold of these players until it's at a time where they're comfortable discussing their future and they can plan like they would want to, and obviously pushing for European football, like you say. I think there's plenty of Liverpool fans who are, I think, pretty obviously desperate for a midfielder, I think, at this stage, and naturally, like Bissouma did in the past, and like Caicedo is now, a midfielder that we see doing so well. I think naturally, I think that fans have been clamouring for any sort of update. But I'd seen appeared to be an interview with the CEO of Brighton a few days ago that seemed to say the same line you're talking about there, that unless there was an extraordinary offer, which there hasn't been so far at all, despite sort of any rumours, that none of those players will be moving anywhere. And that actually brings me on to talk about Caicedo a little bit. Maybe we can talk about him and some other players. I wanted to focus in on who the players you saw as being the key figures so far under De Zerbi. And Caicedo is one that sort of catches the eye, given sort of the role that he plays. I think so, lots of Liverpool fans focusing on him because of the role he plays. But Mitoma, for me, is another one that I really enjoy watching, whether or not I'm just sort of seeing clips here and there, but a really fun player to watch. But I just wanted to ask you who the key figures have been.
Well, Mitoma's a good choice. The inverted wingers, so you've got Mitoma on the left, Solly March on the right. I mean, the one aspect that's always been missing from Solly's game is just the kind of final bit, the end product.
Yeah.
Talented player, local lads, served the club for a long time now, has come through from their time in the Championship, and he's now scoring. He started to score goals. Mitoma, another smart piece of recruitment, signed him from Kawasaki Fontali, loaned him to Union Saint-Gilloise last season, the club in Belgium that Tony Bloom, the Brighton owner-chairman, co-owns. Had a good season there, work permit issues sorted out, has come in and did well at the World Cup with Japan, and he's just so exciting to watch. Quick, direct. He seems to go past defenders with consummate ease.
He sort of glides, doesn't he? Sort of glides over.
Yes, glide. I mean, there was a good example of Goodison last week where, in fairness, the pass should have been cut out, but once he was on the ball, cut inside, and finished with aplomb. Yeah, he's been really exciting. Basically, he was coming off the bench and looking like a real game changer. Mm-hmm. Now more more his starting games. So you've got those two in the wide areas. McAllister, of course, Alexis McAllister had a fantastic role. It goes without saying. I mean, he's not just a World Cup winner. He played a really prominent part in being triumph in Qatar. Now, the interesting thing, since he's been back, Brighton gave him time off, and he only came back last week, is that in the 2 substitute appearances he's made, he's actually played in his Argentina position, which is further forward, kind of drifting in from the left, a bit like he did those link-ups with Messi in Qatar. All season, up until then, it has been Caicedo and McAllister in a double pivot. They've been like the 2 central pairings since the sale of Basuma to Tottenham. That was under Graham Potter. That's how they started the season, under Graham Potter. And De Zerbi had continued that way as well. Now, Alexis' dad, Father Carlos, himself a former Argentinian international, thinks his best position is further forward. And that's where we've seen him in his 2 appearances from the bench since the World Cup. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Pascal Gross has been playing instead alongside Moises Caicedo, and Pascal Gross continues.
I was going to mention, of course,
to confound all criticism. Well, there's not many criticism of him, to be honest with you, because what a signing he's been. He was Brighton's first signing for the Premier League going back to 2017-18. 3 million from Ingolstadt. Been playing loads of position. What he lacks in pace, he more than makes up for in guile and his intelligence. And he's another player who's just flying. He's in great form.
I was going to say he must be something of a cult hero by now, right? In terms of sort of the Swiss Army knife status and just like, always effective.
Yeah, I think he's a coach's dream. You can play him, like I say, almost anywhere, and you know what you're going to get from him.
No, I think it's sort of didn't mention McAllister earlier on. I thought, we were definitely going to. He was going to come up, given sort of just how integral he was. I thought to Argentina's sort of World Cup campaign. He's another one who I think is a really exciting talent. And again, in that position in the middle of the park, full of energy. I remember at Anfield, he quite easily ran through, glided past, and sort of quite a few Liverpool's midfield on the day. So yeah, I'm not necessarily looking forward to seeing him do similar on the weekend. But just before we come to that, just thinking about sort of how this De Zerbi side can continue to develop. As you were talking about there, the chance if you remain on this current trajectory, this current sort of points per game and sort of form that you're in, the possibility of European sort of football coming this season. I mean, where are fans' expectations under De Zerbi at this point? As you say, don't go into any game sort of fearing that you can't compete any longer, and you're proving quite the opposite. And all these real talents in the team as well, in flying form, as you mentioned, 14 goals in the last 4 games. I mean, where are expectations at the moment?
I think they're very high and they've grown. I think it's only fair to point out that, when Graham Potter left for Chelsea, they'd just beaten Leicester 5-2 at home and were 4th in the table back in. Now, that, of course, was pretty unrealistic, really, to expect that could last. But we shouldn't forget the foundations that Graham Potter left behind him. He did a really good job at Brighton. Now that comes with its own difficulties. Funny enough, I wrote a piece about this very subject because obviously so often when does a manager come into a club, it's usually because they're doing poorly. Results are bad, team's not doing well, manager changes. This was one of those situations where he was coming into a situation where Brighton were doing very nicely, thank you, really well. That doesn't leave that much room for improvement. It's almost like you thinking to yourself, well, the only way from here is backwards, is down. you coupled that with a pretty horrific looking first month in terms of the fixtures, and he's kind of overcome all that. He's overcome the fact that he's in a new country, different league. He speaks English, and increasingly so, good English. But he's very determined on that side of things. He's asked for extra lessons. He has a translator alongside him, Enrico Venturelli, who's also the sort of general manager as well, not just a translator. He has him alongside him, but he quite often is doing a lot of his stuff in English now, as I understand it. The team talks primarily in English, and getting his message across. This is where you kind of think with it, like in terms of the improvement, you think if this guy can achieve what he's done so far in the space of, what are we talking about? I don't know, I think it's 13 odd games or something like that. Then just how much better even can they become? Assuming, of course, the situation with the transfer market and recruitment and continuing this stream that Brighton have of keep replacing. That's where they're at now. Really, they've grown to an extent where they have players, and a lot of players, who are good enough to attract big clubs, so that they're into that next level really of their development. You are going to lose some of those players, and it's about how you keep that going, how you replace them.
Yeah, it feels like Brighton at sort of a similar stage than perhaps where Southampton were a number of years ago, where it seemed like lots of players were being scouted very cleverly, coming to the Premier League and then proving that they were more than capable of playing for any side in the Premier League. And then they had this incredible knack of replacing those players, and obviously the academy as well. Does feel as though Brighton, everything is moving in the right direction at the moment. And in terms of looking at games that you've seen under De Zerbi, where you think, okay, that's an example of everything clicking as he would like it, and the performance level being what you think he's after. What games stand out to you? Because there's quite a few sort of real big results we could highlight. But are there any particular games that you think are really great examples of Brighton playing the way in which De Zerbi would like them to?
Yeah, well, obviously the one that people catches everyone's eyes, the way they hammered Potter's Chelsea 4-1 at the Amex. I think there were quite, in a way, unique circumstances attached to that, though. A lot of fans were pretty angry with the not so much that Potter went to Chelsea, but and sort of it was just the scale of the number of staff that also went, not just those that had worked with him before other clubs, but also Ben Roberts, long-serving goalkeeping coach, and Bruno, Brighton's former captain, who'd been on the coaching staff. So there was a fair bit of anger and resentment. It all kind of, but I mean, the atmosphere was crackling that day at the Amex, which it by no means is always the case, but it was that day. So yeah, obviously that was a kind of dream result for him. That was actually his that was his first home win. They'd had a couple of games before that at the Amex, lost 1-0 to Tottenham and drew 0-0 with Nottingham Forest, where they hadn't scored. So that kind of stands out. But I think if you asked him, he'd probably say Southampton away on Boxing Day, perhaps curiously. But they just looked at that. They outclassed Southampton. Now, you have to take into account the quality of the opposition. Dubious quality, it has to be said, the way Southampton are looking at the moment. But they really did look at a kind of different level, really, to Southampton that day. Again, it would be easy to look at the 4-1 at Everton. Again, absolutely outstanding result and performance. But in the second half, what was interesting, and I think is an indication of how he's raising the standards, is that in his post-match press conference, he wasn't happy with the first half performance. He wasn't happy with the way defensively, the way they used the ball. You know, they've just won 4-1 at Everton. They've just scored 4 away goals in a top-flight game for the first time in the club's history. And he wasn't that impressed with certainly half of their performance. So that's kind of an indication of I think that he's kind of raising the bar. You know, there's still this perception. You still see fans of other clubs. It's this little old Brighton syndrome, isn't it? Little old Brighton. Oh, they do what, you know. Well, it's not little old Brighton anymore. It really isn't. It's a club that is on the up, on their way to establishing themselves in the Premier League, which is the long-term vision, is to sort of establish themselves as a top 10 club in the Premier League. So they're not always looking over their shoulder at what's happening at the other end of the table. So yeah, you underestimate Brighton these days at your peril.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree. I don't think, or I hope that no Liverpool fans listening to this podcast are going into the weekend's game underestimating Brighton. I think we've had more than enough examples now to know that that's not something you can do. And I mean, certainly for me, I'm looking at this, especially with the personnel that you have in midfield. Brighton, when they're competing with sort of the likes of Liverpool, where Liverpool's midfield currently is at, I think that's going to be an incredibly tough battle for Liverpool to win, to be honest, which I think says a lot for the quality of the recruitment, how well they're set up, and of course just a side full of confidence at the moment. And given all that, I mean, how are you expecting De Zerbi to approach this game on the weekend? I mean, it's Liverpool in the name, but it's this beleaguered version of Liverpool, which everybody seems to understand exactly how to get to Liverpool's weaknesses, because they're very, very telegraphed at the moment in transition and sort of losing out when it comes to duels in midfield, perhaps due to the aging options there. Every reason to be as positive as possible. Yeah,
absolutely. They'll respect Liverpool, but they certainly won't fear them. They'll be front foot. I mean, one of the things that is, if you like, a continuation of under Graham is that the home results haven't been that great. With a notable exception, really, of the 4-1 referred to earlier against Chelsea. They've still tended to struggle when teams visit playing in a low block, which was the case quite often under Graham, sort of struggling to find a way through, breaking. I don't think that's going to be...
Yeah, don't worry about that, yeah.
Cool, so I think we can forget that. I think the last home game was interesting as an interesting guide. 4-2 against Arsenal. I mean, an eventful game. I think Arsenal, there was a sense that Arsenal got lucky, because although we've talked about McAllister not playing where he was for Brighton, McAllister was missing still, sort of during the celebrations of the World Cup time with Argentina and his family, and Caicedo was suspended. So Brighton were without McAllister and Caicedo on New Year's Eve against Arsenal. That's the only time they've been without those two players simultaneously in the league this season. And Arsenal scored an early goal, which had an element of fortune about it, a couple of deflections off Lewis Duncan, Levy Colwill. And even then, I mean, it looked like Arsenal went 3-0 up early in the second half, and it looked like it could really get damaging. But Matoma sort of inspired, and they were in the game. They were, in fact, it was at 4-2. Matoma had a goal ruled out, one of those
he did, didn't he? Yeah.
Really narrowly offsides where he's not, where you think, where it just frustrates you, really, doesn't it, with some of the kind of the guides. So they weren't that far from giving Arsenal a really hairy final few minutes, which you wouldn't have believed. You'd have struggled to thought that could be the case sort of in the early stages of the second half. So they're pretty much back to strength now. Danny Welbeck, who hadn't picked up an injury during the World Cup when they went off to Dubai, played a friendly against Aston Villa. Adam Webster, central defender, they were both injured in that game. They both came on as second half substitutes in the Cup win at Middlesbrough on Saturday.
Yeah.
So they're pretty much back to strength as well. So he's got some selection decisions to make, but I think it's a tough fixture for both teams.
Yeah, I think there's probably a lot of Liverpool fans listening to this who have been quite unhappy about the last few sentences that you've come out with, Andy, about sort of players being back fit, and of course that pair of Caicedo and McAllister being reunited again. Just out of interest, you mentioned sort of this different role that you've seen McAllister in since he's come back from the World Cup, in the few appearances he's had against a side like Liverpool. Do you think that you're likely to see McAllister in that role again, the more advanced role, with Gross and Caicedo in midfield, or do you think that a game like that might be an opportunity where he De Zerbi sort of thinks, well, actually for games like this, I'll pull you back alongside Caicedo?
Well, I think it's nice to have that option, isn't it?
It is.
Nice option. You've got a World Cup winner, beg your pardon, not winner.
Yeah.
You can put that as well. Who is just comfortable wherever he plays, really. I think the reason for liking him and maybe continuing further forward is to, again, increase that goal threat. That, he's a very technically gifted player. He can spot a pass. He might produce a pass that, unlocks the defence, and he's scoring goals as well. We've seen that too at Middlesbrough. So he just might get more opportunities in advanced areas in that role to cause damage. So, but it'll be interesting to see. It wouldn't surprise me if we see him again in the more advanced position.
Mm-hmm. And so then I guess it's just left for me to ask you sort of what sort of game you're expecting.
I'm expecting an intriguing game. I'm expecting an entertaining game. I think it might be a bit much to ask for a repeat of the 3-3 at Anfield, but I expect there to be goals. I certainly think that's probably going to happen. To an extent, Brighton's they're kind of in their Premier League lifetime so far been based on that a sound defence, and you look at the number of goals, they don't concede many goals. They have conceded more goals under Roberto, but that doesn't mean by any stretch of imagination that kind of ignores the defence, and they've still got Lewis Dunk, the captain, playing really well. I mean, Colwill alongside him on loan for the season from Chelsea. He's had a run of games now alongside him because of the injury to Adam Webster.
Right.
Derby tends to have gone with a back four. More, he doesn't use the back three as much as Graham was. But again, it's not sort of set in stone, the system. But yeah, they've struggled to keep clean sheets. I mean, the goal at Everton, really, Robert Sanchez gave away sort of upended Iwobi right near the end, and he was really annoyed about it. Partly not just the way the goal had come about. Like I say, they've struggled to clean sheets. I'm looking here. The only clean sheet they kept was this rather weird game at Charlton in the Carabao Cup, which was a bit like a training match. It was the first game back from the World Cup break. They totally dominated the game. One of those games where it was the old Brighton not really doing enough with their possession, although Solly March missed a really good chance. 0-0, 90 minutes, penalty shootout. Solly March had the opportunity to put them through, blazed it over, and they ended up losing the shootout. And you look at their results sort of recently, And you look at that game, that was the last 16, so that was a play to the quarter-final. And I think, how on earth did they mess that up, given the way they've sort of been performing? So they messed up the Carabao Cup in a big way. Who knows? The FA Cup, of course, there's a reasonable chance that Liverpool might be back at the Amex within a fortnight or so in the fourth round of the FA Cup, depending obviously on, they've got to get past Wolves at Molineux first. But yeah. So again, I suspect you look at that draw, and it's probably not ideal for any of the teams, if you like, whoever ends up facing each other. Although another of Brighton's eye-catching performances and results was a 3-2 win at Wolves in November. So, as I said before, don't fear anyone really.
Yeah, no, I think there's little reason to. I was looking at that strange scenario that Liverpool could be back at the Amex again, as you mentioned, and then actually we're playing Wolves, in the FA Cup, and then we'll be back at Molineux anyway in a few weeks after that for the game in the league. So there's going to be a few familiar opponents coming up soon for the Reds. And just before we do wrap up, I just wanted to ask your opinion, because it's always interesting to get people's opinion from the outside in who may have not seen as much of Liverpool as the listeners have done. But I mean, what's your general sense of where Liverpool are at the moment? Because I think there's everyone seems to have their opinion, of course, but sort of I'd be interested in your opinion based on what you have seen.
Well, probably not any different to what's generally been spoken about. I think the midfield is the area that you causes the most concern, really, and where they're kind of lacking. That's I kind of think with all these, even the big clubs, to some extent, it's cyclical, isn't it? You cannot expect to sort of stay at these levels. Very few are capable of doing that all the time. Do you know what I mean? Week in, week out, season after season. Inevitably, there are going to be periods where it's a bit sticky and it's not all rosy. I know the expectations of supporters for those big clubs are at different levels, but I think you still got to have faith in Jurgen Klopp to guide them through a sticky patch.
I think that's certainly what people are hoping for, and I think the point you make there is valid. I think that any side that has managed to maintain that level of performance over a long period of time has only ever done that through regular refreshing of the squad and the staff, I suppose, and that's only done one way, unfortunately. So be interested to see sort of what the solutions are identified as being, because I think, as you pointed out there, it doesn't really take a rocket scientist to see where Liverpool are struggling at the moment, given sort of that soft centre. But Andy, as usual, thank you so much for coming on, and it feels like every single time we do speak, Brighton are at a different stage of their evolution, a different exciting stage of their evolution, and it's fascinating to see how far it can go, to be honest. So really appreciate you coming on as usual.
No problem.
And to all the listeners, just before we wrap up here, of course, there's that FA Cup game, that second leg, return tie at Molineux against Wolves, but there'll be a rival Recon ahead of the game on the 21st, when Liverpool welcome Graham Potter to Anfield, and Chelsea arrive, also sort of struggling at the moment for sort of positive performances, for positive results. So that's certainly going to be an interesting game, but there'll be an episode of Rival Recon ahead of that. But between now and then, do check out all the other great content on Anfield and Next Pro. And we'll see you ahead of Chelsea.